Hello, welcome to this week's edition of TyskySour. My name's Bastani. I'm joined, as ever, by my perspicacious co-host, Michael Walker. How you doing, Michael?
I'm very well, how are you?
I'm very good, actually. The weather's not so great, but I'm feeling buzzing after this is the fourth day of a 4-day weekend.
Yep.
Which is what socialism in the very near future is going to look like.
Every weekend.
Well, yeah.
I'm up for that.
A 3-day working week. And we're joined by Jon Lansman. Hello, John.
Hello, good to be here.
Our special guest for this week. Obviously, we've got a lot to talk about, but for those who aren't aware of John's background, his credentials, he's been a member of the Labour Party since you were 16.
Yes.
He was involved in the Tony Benn deputy leadership campaign in 1981. You were involved in his tilt for the leadership in 1988. You're now the editor of Left Futures. When was that?
Well, I was the editor of Left Futures. I think that kind of went a bit by the wayside once we got into the Corbyn campaign in 2015. It kept going for a while, but it's
when was it set up?
It was set up in 2009, late 2008, early 2009, and really took off after the 2010 election.
And you were the campaign manager for Jeremy Corbyn in 2015?
I was. I did the nomination. I was for the nomination stage, but then we recruited Simon Fletcher.
That's right. Sorry.
But I did I was responsible for operations, which meant the digital operations and the field work. And then I was campaign manager in 2016. 2016,
and then after the first leadership race, you helped start Momentum.
I did. Although it was planned from the very beginning of the first leadership election in 2015. That was my objective from the beginning. Was to use that election, if Jeremy got on the ballot paper, to build an organisation. Obviously, we didn't know he was going to be leader to start with. It was a while before we actually allowed ourselves to believe he was going to be leader.
That's a good place to start, isn't it? I suppose we'll start at the beginning.
Okay.
When did you sort of think to yourself that Jeremy Corbyn could be the next leader of the Labour Party?
Well, it wasn't until during the campaign that I actually thought he could be leader. I thought he would do well, by which, if he got on the ballot paper, by which I meant 35 to 40% of the vote. Because I never believed that New Labour had much on the ground, had many people on the ground. And we always knew that we would be able to recruit people into the party. Some people did start coming into the Labour Party even when Ed Miliband, perhaps even before Ed Miliband became leader. The trouble was people were still leaving as well, and so there wasn't a significant increase. But by the time we got to Jeremy, to 2015. It was really possible, and if he got on the ballot paper, and so that was critical. But I thought just his entry into the race would pull the race to the left, and I suppose that's what most people thought, because in the first 2 weeks of that campaign, before Jeremy was a candidate, everyone was scrabbling over Blairite votes, and there just weren't that many.
Was it Michael Crick famously said, "By my rule of the sort of the stalking horse that comes from the right, Liz Kendall will win."
That was the perception, but how wrong, could it have been? And but that's, Andy Burnham had spent the previous 2 years cultivating a left image, and he threw it away in days, chasing votes that turned out to be almost non-existent. And it was lucky that Jeremy got on the ballot paper. I mean, that was hard work, and the truth is that to start with, Jeremy didn't believe he would get on the ballot paper, and but he did, by a handful of people almost being dragged by the collar over the line, and then the atmosphere changed immediately, because that first meeting he did, which was the GMB conference in Dublin, he was just so different. And
he physically changed.
He physically changed. I think the atmosphere began to physically change, because he was so very different, and it was interesting, and it was quite clear from the beginning that the media would cover it, the mainstream media. And it wasn't until I would say mid-July, but that wasn't a long way in, that we thought that he could win. We thought he would do very well, and our optimism increased. And when we first looked at our canvass returns in detail, and and they were big enough to give us a kind of real picture, we just couldn't believe the results, and we weren't prepared. We didn't tell anybody, and it was only when the Times produced their first opinion poll, which absolutely matched our canvass returns, that we realised that it looked like we were going to win, and that was pretty exciting.
Yeah, so you were saying that in that leadership election, all the candidates were trying to court the Blairite vote. And we forget now, but that was because when Labour lost the 2015 election, there was an idea that the British public just aren't left-wing. If the Labour Party ever want to get into government, they have to turn to the right. And you've been part of the Labour Party for 40 years or so, when that has election after election after election been more often than not the consensus, the idea that the British public aren't that left-wing, they won't elect someone on the kind of radical principles you espouse. Have you ever succumbed to that way of thinking, or were you always convinced that if a proper socialist vision was given to the electorate, they'd go for it?
I don't know if I was quite so convinced that they would go for it, but I thought it had never really been tried, not properly, and not in Britain, and so obviously that leadership campaign and the masses of people that flooded in, made us think that it was possible. But even after that, we didn't know until the end of the 2017 election that when you go from 200,000 members up to almost 600,000 members, you think, well, trebling the membership, well, they must be really quite like ordinary people who don't get involved in politics. And I think we now know that they actually are, but we didn't really know for sure until 2017, when we had the boldest leftist manifesto we'd ever had in my lifetime. Well, I think ever in the party's history, actually. 45 is the only other possibility, and people. When you knocked on doors, people had read the manifesto, were excited by it, and voted for it in very much larger numbers than.
So the first year of the Jeremy Corbyn leadership has been very different to really the last 10 months, substantially different. Is there any one thing that you would change, looking back at what you were in control of fundamentally? The relationships you had with high-level people, momentum. Is there anything you thought, well, if we'd just done this, actually, it would have made a big difference? Or do you think, actually, all considered, the coup in 2016, actually, I wouldn't change anything, more or less, we're exactly where I'd want to be? Or is there something you really look back on and think, I wish we'd done that differently?
It's difficult because I was running Momentum, and therefore I wasn't in the position that the people who were in Westminster were, so I didn't have to deal with going to PLP meetings the whole time, and I certainly get the impression that was pretty horrible. But I do think we should have been more confident. I think we should have been confident, in our support from the membership. And had we been more confident in that support, I think we wouldn't have allowed ourselves to be pushed around. I also think we wouldn't have felt pushed into the bunker quite so much if we'd have been more confident in our ability to see off any challenge. When that came and started, I think we weren't totally confident, but it very quickly again became clear that we would see it off. I never thought they would win, but I didn't think we would win as well as we did.
Do you think, so you say at that period in that first year they weren't that confident? We know there was the coup from a bunch of backbenchers during it. Do you think those problems that we saw in 2016 are a thing of the past, or do you think they've gone into the background? To what extent do you look at the leadership and think, yes, this is sorted now, this is a party that's ready to win an election and go into government? And to what extent do you think maybe some of those tensions still exist and it still could go awry?
I think we've seen some tensions in the last few weeks. I think we've seen some tensions over Brexit, some kind of opportunistic use of Brexit as a stick to beat Jeremy with, and I think that's unfortunate. It doesn't help our public image. But I think the vast majority of people who were critical of Jeremy and perhaps still are recognise they can't do anything as long as he's there. But that doesn't mean to say that they aren't pretty determined to make sure that nobody like him gets there again. And I think that's the issue, and so for the longer term, I think Momentum and I have to have an eye for whatever the future brings. I'm pretty confident now that it could bring a Corbyn government, and if it brings a Corbyn government, that will bring us lots of challenges. But if it doesn't bring us a Corbyn government, if something else happens, we've got to rise to those challenges too.
So I guess everybody's watching this and thinking we should ask a question about the goings on of the last 10 days, which is fair enough, I suppose, because you are one of the most publicly visible Jewish members of the Labour Party, but you're also on the left. You've obviously also championed the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, and for a very long time. I'll ask a very banal but simple question to start with. Do you think Labour has an anti-Semitism problem?
Well, there is anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, as there is in the rest of society, and that is a problem that we have to take seriously. And I think I don't think we've addressed it sufficiently quickly or thoroughly or transparently. And I think much of the problem is a problem of unconscious bias. Similar to the kind of bias that we all have, and that's why we send people on awareness training if they're involved in recruiting people, in order to make them realise where their unconscious bias lies. But I think that, unfortunately, there are quite a lot of people in the Labour Party who may well be prepared to recognise some unconscious bias in themselves, but not when it comes to anti-Semitism. And I can't entirely explain that, but I think that is the case, and I think that's why one of the most important things we've got to do is have a campaign of political education about anti-Semitism, make people realise that they have to be careful with their language. They have to understand how Jews will see the language that they use, and to deal with some of the kind of conspiracy theorising that there is, which is extremely wrong and damaging.
What do you reckon, Michael?
Well, there's a difficulty with. I mean, I agree with everything you've just said, and I know Momentum have talked about rolling out a political education campaign, and one of the difficulties I think it will come up against is that obviously one of the reasons there's been quite a lot of denial about anti-Semitism when it has happened is that people have viewed all of this through a factional battle, and which hasn't been helped by certain newspapers and certain characters being rather opportunistic in their relationship to what's going on in the Labour Party, especially with regard to anti-Semitism. But it's made people quite blind to it when it does exist. And I have seen online a few people say sort of like, and they've said it actually about shows that we've done when we've talked about like the left needs to understand anti-Semitism more. They think that we've just sort of bought into a narrative of the other side, and they're like, don't patronise us thinking we need political education. So how much opposition, how much resistance do you imagine sort of seeing among Labour's membership, and especially Labour's left-wing membership, because that's who's seen it through a prism of factional war against them, to a programme of anti-Semitism training? Do you know what I mean? Do you know if people will welcome political education or not, is what I'm saying?
Well, I think there'll be some resistance to it, but I think Jeremy, in his most recent pronouncements, has been pretty clear about the need for a political education programme, and I think the leadership does need to come from the top, and But what Jeremy has most recently said is very helpful. And obviously, I wish we'd said this before. Wish we'd realised this before. But I myself have been surprised by how widespread the issue is. And I'm not talking here about Holocaust denial or blood libel or allegations, whatever. I'm talking about the unconscious bias.
Yeah.
And I've seen on my own Facebook feed. People I regard as friends and comrades saying things which I'm sorry are a bit dodgy. The people, and dismissive of the completely dismissive of the problem. I'm fed up with all this anti-Semitism stuff. I'm sorry. Would you say I'm fed up with all this Islamophobia stuff? No, you wouldn't. And it's not, it's not because of the degree of it, of how much there is around, clearly, Islamophobia is a major problem across Britain and across Europe. But, you don't dismiss any form of racism as something that you're not interested in or concerned about. If there's racism, you deal with it. You've got to deal with it, oppose it. So I think people will come round. Most people will come round. And the people who don't come round, well, do we... we will have to deal with them too.
Yeah. There was I had the misfortune of being on. Actually, it was good fun on This Week with Michael Portillo and Liz Kendall, and Dr. Robert Winston, who's a lovely man, and we were talking about all these issues. And I happened to say, well, actually, I think lots of Brits, which is what you don't grasp. And I was talking to Liz Kendall and Michael Portillo. Lots of Brits will look at that and say, well, why is it anti-Semitic? And they thought I was apologising for it. But that's not trying to diminish it. It's just trying to say, the left talks about everyday racism all the time, everyday sexism. And you think, well, why can't this extend to these issues? And I agree with you about Holocaust denial, et cetera, et cetera. That's obviously small. But when you see, people saying to Luciana Berger, Judas, and it's like, whether or not you think that's racism or just inappropriate or just deeply inoffensive, and there's obviously a line between these and they're very permeable, and it's often based on context, you just think, do you have to say that? Do you have to say Judas? Do you have to, things like that? And like you say, if it's repeated patterns of behaviour, clearly it does resemble racism. It is racism, right?
I agree. I mean, comparisons with Nazis or repeated comparisons with Nazis is not helpful. I mean, using the word, the use of the word Zionism, I suggested it would be better if in a piece I wrote a couple of years ago now that it would be better if people didn't use the word Zionism, and that's just simply because I think people have a very simplistic view of what is Zionism. I mean, the reality is that Zionism has always been a very broad range of things, for the last 120 years, and there's been right-wing Zionism and left-wing Zionism and religious Zionism, and there've been other currents of thought amongst Jews. There were plenty of Jewish communists, there were Jewish socialists, there were Bundists who were in favour of a kind of cultural autonomy, not one based on land, so there have always been many schools of thought. But for most Jews in Britain, I mean, they see Zionism as simply meaning support for the existence of Israel. Most Jews in Britain are critical of settlements and the occupation and recognise that expanding settlements is a barrier to peace. So there is plenty of criticism of the Israeli government and successive governments.
And you think using the word Zionism actually blunts building those alliances with British Jews, perhaps?
I think it does, and I think the line should not be between Zionists and non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. That's a crazy place. Most if not all Jews in the Labour Party believe in two states. And and a Palestinian, including a Palestinian state, and I think we need to build on that. We need to win over the support of that section of the Jewish community, which is actually a majority that wants two states, a big majority, I think. So it certainly isn't helpful to winning the support of the Jewish community to deny the existence of a problem of anti-Semitism. We have very badly damaged our relationship with the Jewish community, but also that poisons our relationship with the rest of anti-racist other communities in anti-racist Britain, or stands the risk of doing so.
It's probably important to clarify. So I thought the article was good that you wrote about the idea that using Zionism as sort of like a sticking point, are you a Zionist or not, when talking about Israel-Palestine is unhelpful. But that's a strategic or tactical point in a way, right? You're not saying that, obviously there's lots of British Jews who self-identify as anti-Zionist and lots within the Labour Party. So then it needs to be...
There are, I mean, you say lots. I mean, it's actually a small proportion of the Jewish community. I mean, I think it's more significant in the Labour Party on the left, but it is a small proportion of the Jewish community. Though I think an increasing proportion of the Jewish community, think you might call us post-Zionist, or non-Zionist. I don't think anti-Zionism is a particularly strong part of the Jewish community.
I suppose I mean a vocal part on the Labour left, which I suppose lots of Labour members will have met in their constituencies as well, especially in London constituency. And I know loads of people, lots of Jewish members who are very militantly sort of define themselves as anti-Zionist.
Absolutely, and of course they're entitled to do so.
That's what I'm getting at. I'm just saying that even though you think it's a strategic error, I think it's important for people to watch it, not thinking, am I going to get disciplined for being...
I think people are entitled to, Jewish members of the Labour Party are entitled to a wide range of views about, the Palestine-Israel conflict, and why shouldn't they express them? But not in a way that is offensive and anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about a member of the Labour. No, I believe they're still a member. They were suspended, but I still think they're technically a member. Ken Livingstone. He isn't Jewish. He is one of the people you could say which is in this area where he's not necessarily denied certain things. Doesn't fit with sort of classical archetype of an anti-Semite for some people. But then when he's asked around a range of issues, he'll talk about the Havara Agreement, which for viewers you can Google it, Havara. He'll talk about how Zionists worked with, like you say, Nazis. There's kind of equivalence between Zionism and National Socialism. Should Ken Livingstone be in the Labour Party, and how welcome are those kinds of conversations? Do you think it's possible you can just say to Ken, cut it out, or do you think there are certain people that are just bent on having these kinds of conversations, deploying these kinds of words, this kind of rhetoric?
I think there's certainly a place for historians to talk about the Havara Agreement, and other aspects of the history of Zionism and the Holocaust and the Nazi persecution of Jews. I mean, there are lots of difficult moral issues, and I've spent quite a lot of my time studying actually the Holocaust, and it was studying persecution of Jews and the Holocaust that kind of brought me to socialism in the first place, brought me to politics in the first place. So I think there's nothing wrong with having those discussions in a kind of serious academic context. But to come out of a disciplinary hearing and go straight into a TV studio and discuss them again, I think shows a lack of an awareness of the problem that Ken had caused, and the first time round. And I think Ken has a very unhealthy obsession with the relationship between Nazis and Jews, and I don't think his perception as a historian is particularly anything to write home about.
So the things you've said so far, I know you want to come in, but I'm not going to press the issue because it's obviously a personal issue. But obviously you've said, I think the whole expanse of the Labour Party, right to left, would agree with what you've said. They may be surprised by it. They may feel very warmed and enthused by it. People are critical of you or I, might be saying, how are they having this conversation? I don't believe it. We would say, well, we've always held these opinions. It's now they're just gaining greater prominence, greater traction. But then the subsequent question is, well, you're saying these good things about anti-Semitism, you're saying these good things about a range of opinion, dealing with people who
things against anti-Semitism.
But
good things against anti-Semitism.
Sorry, did I say that? Did I say the opposite? Sorry.
No.
Well, I think what you mean is you're saying things about anti-Semitism that people on all sides of the Labour Party will be reassured by and support.
It's very reassuring, exactly. But then to put some meat on it, some substance on it, if I was to ventriloquise a sort of a Labour moderate watching this, they would say, well, what would you do about Ken Livingstone? And I don't want to reproduce that politics where it's a binary choice or whataboutery or a gotcha. But that's a pretty good example, isn't it? A public, very prominent Labour member saying exactly the things which we think are problematic. How should the party deal with them?
Well, it shouldn't have taken so long for him to be put through a process. I think there was clearly a cock-up in relation to that process, because when he went back into the studio, it was very quickly announced that he would face further discipline. But then it turns out, only a few months ago, that Ian McNichol announced that, because there was pressure on the end of his previous period of suspension, which was the penalty for after the first hearing, it seemed that there wasn't actually any kind of disciplinary process that had been initiated. Well, I think it has now been initiated. In fact, I know it has been initiated, but we need to get it, up and running quickly. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of investigation required. It's all on. It was all taped and it's all on the record. We should be able to move swiftly to a hearing on that and on some of the other main cases. Now, we do have a process and we have to see that process through. And I would like that to happen as quickly as possible.
I mean, I think one of the difficulties with this kind of case, and I know you're a stickler for rules. So in the Labour Party Campaign for Democracy, Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, CLPD, you're always talking about the Labour Party rules of the Labour Party and how there has to be natural justice and how it all has to be fair. And my question is about how do you build into the rules an ability to deal with something like what Ken's done in a very strong way? What rule has he broken? And do the rules need to be changed so that it's clear what rule he's broken?
Well, we've recently changed the rule to specify anti-Semitism as an issue which can be the subject of a disciplinary action, quite rightly. But up to now, in fact, almost all the cases that have been going through recently have, although they might involve someone who may be alleged to have been anti-Semitic, actually they end up being charged with bringing the party into disrepute. Now, personally, I don't like, that's a kind of catch-all charge which can be used for anything. Now, but actually, I think it is appropriate for Ken because, it's the right charge for Ken because Ken has said something which, whether or not it's anti-Semitic, has caused enormous offence. And he's done it, actually repeatedly. Not just on the occasion when he was disciplined and given a 2-year suspension and the one where he's going to have a hearing, but, in the past, the previous statements, when he's talked about concentration camp, accused journalists of being like concentration camp guards and so on, actually his obsession with Nazis and Jews has gone back many years. And it's in spite of the fact that there are also many good things in his record. He did a lot of good things in London, including combating racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. What he did in County Hall in the 1980s, made it possible for the Blair government to do what it did. And, so all credit to him for that. But because he's been a public figure for so long, longer actually than I think almost any other politician around, since 1981 he's been going, he's been playing, he's been a national figure for all that time. Well, if you're a national figure for that time, you have a responsibility to act with great responsibility. And I'm afraid coming out of a disciplinary hearing and going straight back into the TV studio to repeat what you previously said is not responsible.
So moving on to party reform, which I think is
your specialist subject.
I mean, this is what when people want Jon Lansman in a TV studio, it's been to talk about the future of the Labour Party, what it looks like, organisational change, how we make this politics more concrete within its institutions. What's your view on mandatory selection?
I campaigned for many years for mandatory selection, and I still believe in the accountability of elected representatives, just as I always have done. But actually, we've got a different rule change on the agenda for the conference in September, and that is a kind of you could see it as a compromise. It's a modification to the trigger ballot, which we've had for a couple of decades now, and I think that would have a beneficial effect. But I hope it wouldn't be seen as too threatening. I think trigger ballots, or indeed mandatory selection, make no threat at all to any hard-working MP who treats their members with the kind of respect that you would expect them to. If the people on the left do not likely want to get rid of people they go out campaigning with week in, week out. The left don't like sacking people, and that's why no decent, hard-working MP has anything to fear from the process. But I do think that accountability is a means of bridging the gap between the parliamentary party or indeed electoral representatives and the party membership. I mean, clearly, the party has changed. The membership has trebled, and it is different from what it was when most current MPs were selected. I mean, there are a lot of MPs who've been there for some decades, and it's right that we try and unify the party by bridging that gap. And a bit of accountability is the right way to do it. And I think the public would see it that way. Do they think that MPs should be there for life, whatever, and not be accountable to their community and the party that people vote for? I think not.
I mean, that leads to a follow-up, which is that even if this modified compromise rule changes, presumably we'll see some not hard-working MPs get reselected. And even if they're not popular in their constituency, they've got a big media platform. So say, we won't name any names, but I imagine there's an MP who's been opposing Corbyn for a long time, has also made it quite clear they have no respect for their members, and they get replaced by someone else. If this happens 10 times, they're going to be in the news, rolling news for sort of 2 weeks. Every studio is going to invite them in to talk about how the party's become too extreme. They're being punished by Stalinists who want to purify the Labour Party and make it only for people who are 100% committed to Momentum and Corbyn. Are you worried about that? Do you think that could seriously damage Labour's chances of getting elected when the next election comes around?
Well, I think that the 2 years of internal strife that we had in the lead up to the 2017 general election did damage us in the sense that we started at 27%. If we hadn't have had that 2 years, we would have started at more than 27%. And okay, we achieved the biggest turnaround in British history, in a general election campaign get it from 27 to 41 across Britain, but Great Britain. But we could have done better. So I'm actually relaxed about dissidents, up to a point. I mean, after all, Jeremy was a dissident for many years, and so was John McDonnell. But actually, I don't think Jeremy at any stage got remotely close to people who put in their election addresses that they weren't going to support Jeremy Corbyn, or said on the doorstep that they weren't going to support Jeremy Corbyn to become leader or prime minister anyway. I find that there are a very small number of MPs who've gone much further than we on the left ever did. We had to Neil Kinnock, I was responsible for organising the campaign you referred to at the beginning in 1988 for Tony Benn against Neil Kinnock. That was one challenge, not an annual challenge. And actually, in those days, you could have an annual challenge, but we didn't. And so, okay, there was an attempt to challenge. People would have liked to have challenged Blair, but just that once. We weren't even allowed to challenge when there was a vacancy, when Gordon Brown was crowned leader.
Much to the detriment of the party.
Well, to the detriment of Gordon Brown as well. I think we shouldn't be afraid of occasional challenges. I'm relaxed about that. I'm relaxed about dissent. And the worst thing about the new Labour government was the lack of challenge. And Chilcot, pointed to that. That was one of his chief concerns in looking at the Iraq War. So challenge is good.
I'd agree with that to a point, but don't you think that, and I actually agree that the people who are the real troublemakers, so to speak, is actually very few people. I mean, you're talking maybe a dozen people, who would probably prefer Labour not being in government to being in government with Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. Maybe not
said as much.
I mean, they have, explicitly. So we don't need to name names. People can, they can just watch the last episode. We talk at great length about it. But the problem is, and this isn't something that the left had in the, let's say, late 80s or early 1990s. These people still have a great deal of social capital with lobby journalists, for instance. Yeah. So you've got somebody like a Laura Kuenssberg, who in the middle of the, sort of when this all kicked off, the mural story 10 days ago, and with the Russia stuff as well, they're saying, she mistakenly said about the Russia stuff, for instance, I hear that 2 leading members of the shadow cabinet are going to walk out. Now, that was clearly never true. And I'd imagine it was briefed to her by one of these people. So the problem for a Corbyn government is, it may not be many people, once he's in 10 Downing Street, but actually they do have a disproportionate amount of influence in the media, which means they can't really be compared to the left, even when it was at its nadir and really at odds with the leadership. Is there a problem there in so much as they have these levers, this influence with the print and broadcast media?
Well, I think it's a problem when people take their opposition to such extremes, and I think when they do take it to such extremes, then there's a strong case for doing something about it. And not many cases, but in a few, I think there is. I mean, they do have a much greater access to the media than the left did when it was a kind of internal opposition, but not actually in the Iraq War. In the Iraq War, they did get plenty of media coverage, but that was when it was a much bigger pool of dissent. I hope we won't have that under a Corbyn government.
A Corbyn government, a good segue. What challenges do you think a Corbyn government will face? You've seen a hell of a lot of opposition from the establishment, both within the party, within the media, within business, although it's been more muted than in some other quarters. What do you see as the biggest challenge Corbyn will face if he wins the next general election?
Well, I don't know if I can identify the biggest challenge. I think there'll be a multiplicity of challenges. I mean, we will be trying to, transform Britain in a bigger way than any government has since 1945. And in 1945, there was a massive mandate, it was, Britain was in ruins and needed to be rebuilt. Unfortunately, it's not the Luftwaffe that's ruined Britain, but there's no British industry is in ruins. Lots of aspects of the British economy are in ruins. There are plenty of people living in a state of poverty that amounts to people living in ruins. I think we've got to get the mandate, but we will face enormous opposition. Opposition that, we're now in a global economy. We will be up against business in a bigger way than we've ever been before, we need to ensure that a Corbyn government has active support from the British people. And
what does active support mean?
Well, active support means that Momentum and indeed the Labour Party need to ensure that support is active and vocal, is seen on the streets, is is expressed in workplaces, is expressed in communities, and so the type of community organising, which I'm pleased to say we've begun to build in the Labour Party, but we've got a long way to go with it, is exactly what we need to get in place. Not just to see us win through the next election, by raising the issues that matter to people in the run-up to it, but also after the election, by supporting a government challenging the resistance to the changes that we need to make.
I think we've covered a lot. So I think we should talk about maybe the General Secretary stuff and wrap up. I think we've covered so much so quickly. Or do you want to talk about anything else?
Well, I think we should mention that because there's elections coming up in Momentum.
Oh yes.
Which you're So I think we'll go a little bit more into Momentum. So you're on Labour's NEC. You're standing to be, well, you were appointed to the NCG National Coordinating Group.
I was elected unopposed, actually.
You were elected unopposed.
Time. But this time
there's competition.
This time I'm standing in a different section, quite deliberately. People said I was, I didn't, people accused me of having avoided an election. I didn't specifically, but I'm happy to face an election. And so I chose to do so. And, I'm obviously keen on winning. So.
And what's your pitch? Where do you see Momentum in?
Well,
in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, what are we looking at?
Well,
I mean, you're accruing members very quickly.
500 last week.
Yeah, but some people might be wondering what are you doing with those members?
Well, what we're doing is I think I'm standing on, first of all, on my record, on our record of achievement over the last couple of years, which I think has been tremendous. We've mobilised people to achieve that fantastic turnaround in the general election campaign. We have, won overwhelming support at conference for all of the issues that Jeremy stood to argue for. We've won, something over 20 great candidates in marginal seats who are going to fight, that we backed and won those elections that are going to, will help to push the PLP into the direction that we need it to go in order to support, to give the necessary support to a Corbyn government. So there are many things that that we have already achieved. I think there are things that we need to do that we haven't done. We've begun on training people on things like community organising and persuasive canvassing that talks politics to people on the doorstep rather than simply collecting data. We've taught party activists how the Labour Party works so that they can understand how to influence it. But I think we need to do a lot more than that, political education. And okay, we've talked a bit about that in relation to anti-Semitism. But I think we need to cover the whole programme.
Yeah.
There was when I joined the Labour Party, actually the Labour Party had a political education unit. It hasn't got that,
No.
and I think Momentum needs to step into that gap and do it. Maybe in the end we'll persuade the Labour Party to do it itself.
I was going to say, do you think Momentum's got the resources to do that? Because that would be, and we're probably all on the same page about political education. So for me, that would look like probably a new unit. You'd probably have some kind of, for me, a qualification maybe for chairs, for political education officers, maybe for membership officers, so they can all work together, how to run meetings, how to be inclusive. And I was even thinking, like, each member could get like a kind of book. Of course, it would be a little red book. And it would be... No, but this is really important. How many Labour members know how to write a motion? Or do they know about the branch structure? Or, we just had, we'll talk about this towards the end, I guess, and about the General Secretary election. And I know this is a bit more ambiguous about the rules governing this, was it, first past the post or elimination, etc. Members don't know this stuff. And I find it's remarkable that, there isn't a single document. It could be given to you, and it could be... People talk about a card-carrying member. I mean, that would be a really meaningful document if it's like everything you need to know to upgrade yourself as somebody who can change your community, as somebody who can be within a broader army of persuaders to change the country. I mean, that'd be a really exciting thing to get. At the moment, it's like you get this number, this card that is about, it's like a travel card, a day pass on TfL, falls to bits in 10 minutes. I mean, but that would cost a lot of money, right? So how can Momentum do that in the absence of the Labour Party doing it?
Well, I think one of the things that Momentum's got quite good at is scaling up its operation when it needs to, and even the training that we've done so far has been about training trainers who in order to be able to scale up and roll it out. But I think we need to produce materials, we need to produce videos, so that people can organise it themselves. And which is what the original, when I first joined the party, that's what the Labour Party's political education unit did. So we've got. What we've done in the World Transformed is an extremely good start to all of this. It has, even people on the right are, accept that it's exciting and dynamic and interesting and creative, and we've got the people who can do a lot more of that.
Isn't John McTernan a Momentum member?
Well, he says he is. I haven't actually checked the database, but yeah. Well,
Welcome sign, I guess.
yeah. I hope he pays more than the. I hope he's not on an unemployed rate. That's all I want to know. We want the full tenor from John. Have you had him on here?
Who was on All the Best with Max and Matt.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that's what. Yeah.
And I thought, actually, you should listen to it. I don't think he was very good. I think he was very slippery, but he had a good answer for everything, actually, which you'd expect. Yeah. And I thought Max and Matt were too nice to him.
Right.
So, if you want to get yourself angry, say Max, because Max was giving him the sort of the lines about, well, like, oh, you're just sellouts, all this stuff. And I thought there was a level of nuance to John McTernan that they weren't expecting. I don't know. He wasn't this kind of like nasty, visibly sort of malicious Blairite. He actually had pretty good answers as to why you would want, market mechanisms in the NHS and so on. Which on the left, we haven't been thinking at that level. Obviously, some of the left has, but the average lay member wants to be able to have sort of arguments to rebut this stuff, not just obviously with other members, but with members of their community, which I guess feeds into this conversation about political education.
Last question about Momentum. So
I mean, we've blazed through this, I think. So yeah, if you like.
So you sort of mentioned that people on the right of the party now are accepting that Momentum can be a force for good. You've cleaned up your image in the media. So I think Momentum went from sort of like the whipping boy of British politics, being called a bunch of thugs, a rabble, and now you've moved into a position where you're recognised as a legitimate part of British politics. At the same time, there are some people, some groups within Momentum who have certain concerns about how the organisation has functioned, particularly in regards to democracy. And there are some people who would say that even though Jon Lansman has said he's an advocate for democracy within the Labour Party, he hasn't acted with that same rigour in Momentum. And they'd say in a more strong way that Jon Lansman's been anti-democratic in the way he's acted in Momentum. Is that fair?
Of course not. Completely unfair. We're not a political party. We're not trying to write a manifesto in Momentum and impose it on the Labour Party. We've got lots of different views. We're a pluralist organisation, far more pluralist than any other left organisation, I think, of its size that there's ever been in Britain. And we value that pluralism, and we have good debates at the World Transformed and elsewhere, yes, but we don't necessarily resolve those debates by having a vote and forcing 49% of the people to accept the views of the other 51%, which I think would be a mistake, because we're not a political party. We're an agent of change, primarily. We're there to keep Jeremy in the job, to ensure that he, that the changes that we need to make to the party to deliver what we stand for, which includes democratising it, includes ensuring that we win progressive policies and develop them over the in the period between now and getting into government. Those things are going to happen. We need to make sure that he wins. In the 2017 election, unfortunately, we couldn't rely on the party machinery to win. To the extent that we did, which wasn't obviously winning the election, but we won, a lot of seats. All my lifetime, I've been accused of not really being interested in winning and only actually being interested in protest. And yet, at this election, it was us that made it obvious that we were interested in winning. We went out. Our members went out. Our 500,000+ members went out to the places we needed to win. When the party was telling us to go and support people who racked up majorities, over 10,000. So those are the things that we've got to do in the future.
Do you want to leave it at that? We've got the Momentum members. I mean, this is
I was expecting some outraged comments. But everyone's pretty friendly.
I think these people can be a lot louder on Twitter and Facebook than maybe in reality, which is maybe your experience when you go to groups. I don't know. I mean,
it sounds like what you were explaining then is that Momentum was launched with a certain ambiguity about what it was, and whether or not it would have motions and political positions which would require a certain level of democracy. And you're saying because it doesn't have policy, or do you imagine Momentum ever having policy?
I think a lot of the established left, as it was in the run-up to 2015, wanted an organisation that was like the established left in the run-up to 2015. And Momentum is something that looks very different from that, and quite rightly so, because we've brought in people with different experiences, with different ideological backgrounds, with different styles of campaigning and organising, and we are a lot richer for that. And so we have developed a completely new sort of left organisation. And I grew up in the traditional left model of organisation, and it was a kind of fairly agonising process those early months. There was a lot of argument that we had, but people from different backgrounds have ended up in an organisation which is effective and has proved itself to be effective. And you don't become effective by spending all of your time having introspective arguments in order to win control of a diminishing organisation, because people just aren't interested in that.
Do you think that was
that was what was happening? Yes. I mean, we went through actually two cycles. We went, after the initial establishment, there was enormous enthusiasm from that first leadership campaign, which got eroded by the arguments, and it was only the coup which made everyone come back. And it then started happening again, and that's why we had to introduce a new constitution to make sure it was effective. And we've got a horizontal campaign. We don't tell local groups what to do. They do. They choose their own priorities. There's no democratic centralism. We don't tell them what they've got to campaign for. And you can have national groups. On the NHS or on other policy areas. We can have two opposing groups on the same policy area. Actually, why not? We're here to provide space for people to organise progressive, campaigns and policy debate and activities.
But on the issue of candidate selection for parliamentary seats, I mean, there's been a bit of dissent around that.
That's a good example, and I think we do need to review how we've done it and learn from it, because there have been some tensions between the local and the national. I mean, I saw it from the centre. Well, I and others in the centre saw it as being about getting the best that we could out of the process. Having the biggest impact on the next PLP, and obviously you don't do that without talking to people on the ground. But actually, you have to talk to all the people on the ground, and we had to, we talked to the unions and we worked with the unions, and we didn't have the resources to fight every battle everywhere. We just didn't have enough full-time staff, and and it all happened in a very, very short time. In Scotland, we're selecting in the next few months a large number of people who potentially could win their elections. That's just in one in Labour Party terms region of the country, in one nation, and so there were lots of compromises, and I think we've got to learn from that experience. And yes, sometimes there were tensions that we need to work out how to resolve. So we need to modify the processes, but I think we can do that.
It's kind of a miracle that Momentum's lasted this long, I think. And I mean, I remember I mentioned this in passing, and then Conor Pope from Progress picked up on it, and then he started to sort of use it as a positive thing. So I said, without the coup, I don't think there would have been a hung parliament, in 2017, which many people agree on. Yeah. Because it reanimated, like you say, the spirit of the previous year. And actually, when I saw the operations in 2016, I thought this is easily coming out of a digital politics scholarship, how people are using new media, not just to project influence online, but also organise offline. Yeah. I thought this is the most advanced campaigning in Britain by far ever, using this stuff. And it was really allowing people to refine techniques and processes that I think were decisive, actually, in the last general election. But when I think about Momentum, you were just saying earlier on, I had a thought, is it the most important left-wing organisation in the history of Britain? Other than obviously the Labour Party. You've obviously got a few examples at the turn of the 20th century, but its influence is pretty massive when you think about it. I mean, do you ever think about it in those terms, about history being made, or are you sort of so immersed in the day-to-day stuff that it's just getting Jeremy Corbyn into 10 Downing Street, Labour forming a government? Or do you ever rest on your laurels? Do you think, wow, this has kind of surpurprised me, wow.
Well,
I mean, it surprises us, right?
No. I think it is a massive exercise. I mean, we've built something that, well, I mean, I suppose, we're going to be bigger than the Tory party in the next election. We're growing by, 1,500 a month. We're virtually on 40,000, and that is a big organisation, and we've got a turnover, we've got a big turnover, we've got staff, but also, I'm just very conscious. I've been on the Labour left for getting on for 40 years, and the left has this fantastic capacity to, for self-immolation and self-destruction, and we have basically avoided that. And when we've got people, in local groups, never mind nationally, from very different backgrounds, sitting down and getting on with a useful political job, and that's fantastic. And I mean, I suppose that's what made us introduce the Constitution in the way that we did. It wasn't a process that I felt comfortable about. It wasn't a process that we designed. We felt it was absolutely necessary because we had such a fantastic opportunity, and it was the only way of doing it. It was the only way of keeping it on track. And I to be honest, I feel the same way actually about the anti-Semitism statement we put out today. I think there will be people who won't be happy with it. Although actually we had nobody on the national coordinating group that agreed it. Nobody said they were against it. So that's great.
Where can people find that statement if they want to?
It's on the Twitter feed.
It's on the Twitter
Guardian
feed,
as well,
and
right?
The Guardian covered it very, very fully. I haven't seen who else has covered it since, but it's. I mean, we'll get it up on the website. But
yeah, it was an impressive. I thought it was an impressive statement. I think this is the thing. I think the last year, I think even on the right of the party, there's now a grudging resentment that Momentum is this. Ultimately. I mean, it's everything you want in politics. It's about allying principle and power, which is what the likes of Blair and Campbell have been banging on about for 10 years. And actually, I think Momentum is a great synthesis of these two things. We're going to finish now.
That's what you call a soft question, isn't it?
What's that? What's the soft question?
Do you think Momentum's the best organisation that's ever existed on the left?
No, but hold on. It's you've got to look at it in historic context.
Yeah,
and obviously, but to us, it's like people we know, and it's it's the people you've been working with, and it's kids coming through the door. And, but you look at it in historic context. Just of course, there's a few things. Beginning of the 20th century. I mean, historically, they're more important than Momentum so far. Yeah. But in terms of where it could end up, it really could be one of the most. I know that sounds like a silly point to make, but a left organisation on the left of the Labour Party with 40,000 members. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that being, almost
no one would have guessed it.
Implausibly funny.
Yeah.
So yeah, should we talk about the General Secretary stuff?
Yeah. So so much has gone on in the last month that it almost feels like ancient history. But there was a General Secretary race when Ian McNicol resigned, and you stood, and then stood down.
I did.
Do you want to explain, or could you explain both of those decisions?
I stood because I felt that if I didn't, we weren't going to have a proper process, a proper open and transparent process. It wasn't because I was in any way against Jenny Formby, who has been appointed, and I think she's going to do a great job. And it wasn't because I didn't want a woman General Secretary. I thought that was a very good idea. And we did eventually have, a short list of 2 women, which was great, from which Jenny was appointed. I want to make, I don't want the party simply to be a left version of the party that we had before. I do not want a left-controlled command in a party in a command and control way. I want a different kind of party, and I believe that that's what Jeremy wants, and that's what the hundreds of thousands of people who joined the party to support him want. And I think that's what Momentum is pretty determined to get. and I withdrew because I think by that point my point had been made, and so it wasn't about me. It was about making sure the process was right.
Would you like to see the General Secretary elected in the future? Because it's obviously something, I think you've publicly said that anyway, but I mean, how important is that for you?
I think it's not everybody on the left is convinced that's the right idea, but I think it's not the only way of doing it. You can have a good process for appointing general secretaries, which which still ensure proper accountability to the national executive. I think I think one of the problems is the national executive has been stripped of its genuine governance responsibilities and powers, and we need to make some changes in order to get back to that. But I think it's a good model. It's after all a model that trade unions themselves use. They elect general secretaries by law, admittedly, but those general secretaries are still accountable, in different ways depending on the structure of individual unions to their their democratic structures. And so unions like Unite and Unison have general secretaries who are elected and are accountable to a large executive. And why can't that work in the Labour Party?
I mean, we've recounted our points around this, I suppose, consistently, but I think you said it first to me, and I thought it was really interesting. The idea that once you're in power, a dual power approach within the party of elected leadership, both within the parliamentary party and then with HQ, that makes so much more sense, because how can the leader of the parliamentary party be accountable for, be responsible for oversight of, how do we expand the party's influence, increase its members, increase its resources? Clearly, when you're having to govern the UK, that's of massive, quite rightly, secondary importance. So I think that, for me, was the most decisive thing, is that you probably have to have an elected General Secretary when you're in power. If Labour's in power for 15, 20 years, and you don't want to neglect this organism, which is going to empower, hopefully, millions of people, then, it seems to me it isn't actually a bureaucratic position.
And that is the practice of a lot of other left parties around Europe, social democratic parties and other left parties around Europe. So it's not exactly a unique concept to us in the Labour Party in Britain now.
Can you see it happening? How close is that debate to being won on the NEC? Because that's presumably who'd make the decision.
No, I mean, we haven't had the discussion on the NEC, and I'm looking forward to having it. And sometimes it takes a while to get these reforms, even if they're good ones. Maybe it'll go through this year. Maybe it will take another 10 years to achieve it. But I do think I think it's a good reform, and there's quite a lot of support for it within Momentum. We'll see.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people say to me, I don't necessarily agree with the fact it should be elected, but they say that the absence of a broader debate around it isn't good. It's not, it's not conducive to a strong political project, which is what all of us want. And that was the most disappointing for me. It wasn't necessarily the outcome, so to speak, but it was the fact there wasn't. I mean, I wrote a piece at Novara Media. We did a podcast about it. We tried to catalyse that conversation, but it just didn't happen because so many people, actually, it was mostly online, but genuinely trying to dampen that conversation. And of all the situations where you think that shouldn't be happening, it's an eliminative ballot. There was no right candidate. Of all the times where you could probably do this without any concern about, an intervention by the right, this was it. And yet it didn't happen, which was disappointing. Michael, any final points?
No, I was just looking at some of the questions.
Oh, yeah, let's pick up some questions from online.
Oh, who's that about, though? The Tories are now ahead in the polls because they are going for the jugular. Why are you not more concerned? I'm not actually sure if that's to you or to a previous commenter. But
are you too relaxed?
Are you too relaxed about the Tories going on the jugular?
Well, I'm feeling quite relaxed at the moment. But am I relaxed about the Tories being ahead in the polls? No, when they are ahead in the polls. No, I'm not relaxed about that. No, we've got to beat them. Why would I be relaxed?
How accurate do you think the polls are?
Well, we don't know, do we? Because the problem with the polls in the run to the last election has not been resolved, and and most of the polls are still using the same methodology that most of the polls used in the run-up to the election, and in the end YouGov abandoned actually. Sorry, and YouGov abandoned its alternative approach. So maybe it's understating but anyway, we can't speculate on that. Well, we can speculate, but we can't know the truth. But of course, it was the case. That's one of the fundamental reasons why it was irresponsible of the party to assume that we would be at the bottom end of the range of predictions of the polls last time. Because if you read the pollsters, I look at polls. Well, I don't get quite so much time these days, but historically I've looked at polls a lot, and the pollsters were quite clear that you couldn't know what the right, that there were, that were genuine uncertainties, and you couldn't know, what the right prediction was. And in the absence of uncertainty, you've got to, consider the full range of possible outcomes, rather than going with, the majority. And the party wanted to throw all its eggs into the wrong basket. As it turns out, and we went with what people felt on the ground. We didn't have access to their data, but maybe that was part of the problem. I mean, I do think that what happened nationally, in other words, the kind of very different patterns in some place, the big differences in patterns from one place to another, were also reproduced at a local level, and yet people weren't going. To the people still focus on the estates that 30 years ago used to yield 85% of the population up to the polling station, and now it's only 35%, but they're still the biggest block of votes, so they still look at they still focus on those places. And so I think there is a resistance to change and recognising that. We're winning votes from different people and different places than we used to.
It was in Croydon. Was Sarah Jones's seat Croydon South?
Croydon Central.
Croydon Central.
It's not Croydon Central.
It's what's it called?
One of the Croydons, anyway.
It's the middle one. Anyway,
it's not Steve Reed's, right? Obviously, that's Croydon
Maybe
North.
It's Croydon Central.
Anyway,
one of the Croydons.
I think John was right. Anyway, doesn't matter. Sarah Jones's seat, and we were canvassing there because I live in South London, I live in Crystal Palace, and we were canvassing there quite regularly. We didn't really need to canvass locally in Lewisham, Western Penge, pretty much a safe Labour seat. So a lot of people in our neck of the woods were going to Croydon, and what was interesting was that people were saying on the day itself, they were saying, well, the data we're getting, the responses we're getting from on the doorstep, we think it's too close to call. And people are saying, well, look, I've been on the high street every day this week, and everybody I talk to is voting Labour. I'm speaking to professionals who have, concerns over Brexit. Yeah. They're voting Labour because they're really enthused by X, Y, Z, and they're giving me, it's not fluff. They're giving me really strong reasons why they're voting Labour, and I believe them. And it turns out that was far more reliable than the data coming off the doorstep. And now we're seeing it with the local elections. I'm knocking on doors, and you've got bad data. You're knocking on doors and nobody's in, and after 2 hours and you've spoken to two people, neither who are Labour voters, you think, how is this a good use of my time? So there's still a long way to go, right? I mean, I look at the impact, and again, it's not to be obsequious to Momentum, or even, it's really just Momentum on the left, how advanced some of the stuff is, and then you do your local canvassing elsewhere, and it's not great. We need an app. Where's the app? We're a month out from this local election, right?
We need an app.
Navarra needs an app as well. And by the way, before we go, and before I forget, click that subscribe button. Jon Lansman is just one of many incredible guests we're going to have on over the next several months, I guess, really, on the way through to the summer and summer recess. We'll take a break then. But click subscribe, click that little bell button so you get a notification every time we come live. If you want to support us, go to support.navarramedia.com. Help us build a new media for different politics. We're trying to do some big stuff, as we've been talking about. I've got one final question for John, but maybe you want to ask one.
No,
beforehand.
you go for.
Are you sure?
Go for it. Yep.
There's a rumour going around that you're releasing a line of shirts. Is there any truth in that?
Sadly, not. No. When I finally do retire, then maybe I'll go into shirt production, but not yet. No.
I think there could be a big merch line in Jon Lansman shirts.
It could be a big source of income for Momentum and the Labour left.
We'll look at it, yeah.
It could be like Elon Musk with these like stupid gadgets. The Jon Lansman shirts could actually be like, That would pay for like 3 or 4 regional organisers. Anyway, you've been excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll be back on Thursday.
If you're up for it, yeah.
We'll be back on Thursday, Gary. It's all contingent on Gary. He's the boss. So, John, thank you again.
Thank you.
We'll be back on Thursday.
See you then.
See you later.